So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming. My name is Alex Wynn. I'm a professor in the political science department, and I'm also a professor of international security over at the Mershon Center, which is also sponsoring this event, along with actually the Department of Political Science and the Culture of Science and Technology program in the Department of Comparative Studies. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Steve Fuller as part of the Mershon Speaker Series. And I think that the fact that this event is sponsored by 3 different departments says something about Steve's scholarship, which is highly interdisciplinary. And he's currently, for example, a chair professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. That's his address. But he was trained as a historian and philosopher of science. And although that's his background, the reason he's here is that I invited him to a conference that I put on in Mershon the last 2 days on quantum theory and international politics, for which somehow his work was again relevant. So Steve is best known for his foundational work in the field of social epistemology, which is the name of a journal that he founded in the late 80s, and also of your first book, or one of your earlier books anyway.
Social Epistemology was the first book, yeah.
Okay. And he has actually published over 20 books altogether, which is an amazing feat for someone my age. His most recent books are Knowledge, The Philosophical Quest in History, 2015, and then in 2016, The Academic Caesar. His work has been translated into over 20 languages. And his latest book is PostTruth, Knowledge is a Power Game, which was published in 2018. Today, in the PostTruth Condition, which I'm assuming is a book, why it's unlikely to go away anytime soon. Join me to
Thank you. For the first thing I want to say is I want to thank Alex for inviting me, and in particular, kind of the unique sort of person that Alex is, in that he was running this conference for the last couple of days on quantum mechanics and social science, which is a very unusual combination, but nevertheless I think it's one that's very fruitful, okay? And maybe this is the context in which I actually got brought out here in the first place. Namely, I do a lot of strange, weird things. But I do think that when we think about the post-truth condition, and again, let me just remind you about how the post-truth condition came into being. The term was used a lot in the year 2016 because of first Brexit, and I'm in the UK, so the idea of the British Britain leaving the European Union was a very important issue. But also the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, that was very important as well. And so at the end of 2016, the Oxford English Dictionary declared post-truth as the word of the year, okay? And it was on that, and when you hear something being declared as word of the year, you kind of wonder whether this is just something of the moment or whether it is something that in a sense reflects something that's been going on for a long time. And I'm of the latter opinion, okay? So the idea is that post-truth has always been with us, okay? And it's only because of the combination, you know, a kind of perfect storm, harmonic convergence, depending on how you look at these matters, that you know, Brexit and Trump happens at the same time. But the point is, the general phenomena that it reflects has been around with us for a long time, and in a way, it's been around, you might say, in one sense, kind of from the standpoint of the people who have thought about it a long time ago versus the people who are catching up to figure it out now, okay? And so, as with all this stuff, and this is kind of the issue that arises in my book, Plato. Plato's always the man, right? I mean, and what we're talking about here is basically the kind of issues that Plato was concerned about. Because if you think about Donald Trump, and if you go back, those of you who are old enough in the audience, and there are a few old people here, You go back 30 years, 40 years, Ronald Reagan, right? We're talking about actors, as it were, operating, in a sense, in the political sphere. And this was the kind of thing that actually Plato was worried about, okay? So what he was worried about, and this is kind of what the post-truth condition is about, he was worried about who were the kind of people who defined the conditions of possibility for how people decided what was true or false. Okay? That's the post-truth condition is a realization of that. Okay? Now, in the Republic, so again, you have to go back to Plato. If you look at the period before Plato's Republic, before the fall of Athens, because basically Plato is a late-coming disciple of Socrates, right? And soon afterwards, Athens will fall, right? Prior to that point, what you see is a society that at one level seems very vibrant and exuberant and has all of this stuff that we now value so much about the playwrights, Euripides, Aeschylus, Sophocles, guys. There were sophists as well. And so there was a lot of kind of turmoil, tumult, everything going on in this society that was calling itself democratic. And part of what was going on was that basically there was this idea that anyone, at least people who were regarded as citizens, had the right or had the capacity to actually understand and use the means by which power could be governed in the society. Okay? And in fact, the sophists, and this is one of the things that Socrates is so much concerned about in Plato's dialogues, is whether, you know, the idea that you could actually teach people how to do things that lead to good governance. Right? In other words, if I pay you enough, I can just teach you, and that's the end of the story, regardless of whatever prior moral, whatever issues you might have before that. I could just tell you how to do it. Now, the post-truth condition is about a realization that this, in a sense, is kind of how the world works. Okay? So in other words, insofar as the sophists had success in Athens, insofar as the playwrights and dramatists in Athens had success, right, there was a sense in which, well, you know, in a sense, anyone could be doing this. And they could be presenting their views and so forth, and then just see how people respond to them. Okay? Now, again, we call this democracy nowadays. But the problem was that in the context in which it operated the first time around in Athens, it led to chaos and eventually the fall of the society. Okay? And Plato saw this. And so one of the things that Plato was very concerned about was that there actually would be restrictions on the sort of people who could actually dictate the conditions under which one could decide what was true or false. In other words, it wasn't just a rhetoric, whatever kind of, you know, arguments you could make that can get people to agree with you, but rather there should be a kind of common standard and there should be some way of maintaining that. And so the problem with drama was that drama actually enacted in a so-called, what we would now call fictional way, what actually, to a large extent, one could see normally in society, but it would seem to be in a different direction, in a different level, a different, you know, sometimes extreme even. Okay? And the problem was because if the actors were good, it would be incredibly realistic, right? In the way we use the word realistic in that sense. And so as a result, people would then want to do what the actors were doing on the stage outside the stage when they left the theater. This was the problem, all right? So in other words, the kind of distinction that we normally enforce between fact and fiction in terms of the possibilities that are allowed and the possibilities that are not allowed were being blurred in classical Athens. Okay? And this was this thing that, in fact, Plato was very much concerned about, because he thought this led to, generally speaking, instability in the society, because people basically thought that the kinds of things that they saw, you know, on the stage were the sorts of things that they could take outside and, you know, enact and behave and act and so forth, and perhaps even influence what happens in politics. That's the thing that Plato was concerned about. So Plato comes up with this kind of story, which turns out to be persuasive for various reasons across various cultures, largely in the broadly speaking Western world, but also in the Islamic world as well, about trying to draw a strong distinction between fact and fiction, right? So the idea being that there is a kind of real world in which politics is enacted in the real way, and that's what you should believe in, versus all this stuff that you might see on stage, which in a sense is just fictional. It is impossible, okay? And not only that, as you may know from Plato's pure standpoint as expressed in the Republic, that Plato was in fact wanting to ban poets and playwrights and so forth in the ideal republic. So in other words, the conditions for possibility that an ordinary citizen would be presented with would be ones that would be dictated by the government. So in other words, the fact that people could think about other things and so forth would not actually be given this kind of free public voice. So in other words, people would not be in a position to really have to decide, you know, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and so forth, right? But rather, there would be a very strong distinction sort of enforced at the outset. And so what we call the fact-fiction distinction now derives from this. This is the point, one point that I would make, because I'm someone who takes very seriously, in terms of the history of politics, that politics, as Bismarck said in the late 19th century, art of the possible. You have an issue here? Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, I take it you guys can hear me. You're responding intelligently. Okay. But the idea of the, you know, when we think about politics as the art of the possible, right, we're talking about what exactly is possible and not possible. And this is what Plato was concerned about. And so in my book on the post-truth condition, I talk about this as modal power, right? Modality is a certain way of thinking about metaphysics where you're concerned about what is possible, impossible, contingent, necessary, etc. Okay? And so what politics is about is being able to make those decisions, make those, you know, make those decisive moments where you say, okay, you know, in theory, in some sense, something might be possible, but it's not really possible in practice, right? In which case, then it becomes impossible. And the question then becomes, circumstances, are these things established? And that's what modal power is about. And that was, to my mind, that is what Plato was talking about, namely, sort of defining the sphere in terms of which things were regarded as possible or impossible. And the problem with the dramatists and the poets was that they opened up a much larger sphere of possibility that Plato thought could actually be entertained. Okay? And in fact, when Plato talks about the sort of people who ought to be entitled to rule, right, they're the kind of people who the public would see as being the people who actually understand the only way to go. Okay? So it's not that might makes right, but rather right makes might. Okay? So in other words, if people could see that the way you're operating is really the only way to go and the alternatives are all bad, right, then that's the way you should go, and that's what people believe. And the point of Plato's Republic with regard to the philosopher king and so forth was about training people who would have the right mindset to be able to command the kind of authority whereby right makes might. And right makes might means that you end up convincing people that there's really no other way to go. And as a result, this is the way to go. And you are the one speaking for the right. Okay? That's the Platonic philosopher king thing. It's not like might makes right in the sense that we have to battle it out, blah, 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 but rather that people will see conceptually, that they will believe that there's really no other way to go. And so much of what Plato's Republic is about with regard to the education of the philosopher king and so forth is to get people into this mindset of thinking, first of all, of a modal mindset, whereby you say, only this can happen, and all the other stuff is irrational, it's crazy, it's, arbitrary, blah, blah, blah. That's what Plato's trying to actually get to, a society that he thinks will be run well if people actually think this way. Okay? Now the thing is, I think this is kind of, you might say, the beauty of Plato's vision is contrary to a lot, because as you may know, I'm someone who's very sympathetic to Karl Popper as a thinker, both in science and in politics. But if you read a work like Open Society and Its Enemies, okay, which was published shortly after the end of World War II, you get this feeling, if that was your first introduction to Plato, that Plato is some kind of, proto-Nazi, proto-Soviet, totalitarian, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, he's sort of imagining this as happening in a much more light touch way. Okay? Plato obviously, he's writing in the 3rd century, 4th century BC, right? He doesn't have all this kind of apparatus of coercion that we associate so much with the modern nation state, right? He's really trying to wage a sort of propaganda campaign in a very subtle kind of fashion. That's kind of what he's doing, right? And he never talks about violence or anything like that as the means by which he would bring about what he's talking about, right? He's talking about, so there's something very interesting. It's a little bit different from the world we're in now, right? So there is this sense in which Plato thought he could accomplish what he wanted to accomplish, whereby one would only think certain things are politically possible, and that would then ensure the stability of society, right? He thought that could only be brought about under a regime, given that we're talking about 3rd or 4th century BC, right, that didn't have the kind of stuff that we could do to force people to do things. Okay? So he's imagining a kind of light touch by our standards. Okay? And this is going to have to do with the way in which people are taught to think about themselves, right? And how they are taught to think about others. And this is obviously part of what Plato's talking about, right? But in a way, if you have to imagine how this gets enforced, it's going to be through peer pressure. I think from the standpoint of what we talk about now, it's peer pressure. That's what I would say. Okay? How Plato's regime would actually work would be peer pressure. Okay? And this is not an unusual thing. If we talk about Rousseau, for example, I think it's a similar kind of idea, actually, that Plato and Rousseau are very much in synchrony with each other, except their goals are somewhat different, but in terms of how they think they would bring about a kind of homogeneous kind of, thought collective, not so different, okay? But this is kind of what we're talking about here. Now, the point about the post-truth condition in all this is that Plato is like what we would now call something like a spin doctor, okay, in a democratic society, right? Because the point about Plato was presenting himself as being the only guy who could do this. Now, what happens when there are a lot of guys who claim they can do this? In other words, they're not simply the sophists who would say, I can teach you the skills to win an argument at the object level, at the first order level, as we talk about it in logic and in philosophy. But rather, I'm talking about the second order level. That is the level in which I'm able to control the rules of the game, right? The conditions under which people then position themselves. That's what Plato's talking about. And Plato's Republic is about gaining a monopoly on that, okay? And when you gain a monopoly on that, you get a truth regime, to use this kind of, right, Foucault, whatever, trendy stuff that we talk these days. I have to say, as someone who grew up when Foucault was still kind of a radical thing, people who still talk this way sound to me a little old-fashioned, but I know there's some Foucauldians in the audience, and just to sort of pay some kind of lip service to you, truth regime. Okay? You get it, right? So the point is, the idea is that that if you're able to control the rules of the game, you're able to enforce a truth regime, right? And that then becomes the rules of the game for everyone. Everyone is forced to somehow, as it were, define themselves, interpret themselves in terms of that, okay? But what makes Plato interesting, I think, from the standpoint of the post-truth condition, is Plato is coming to this issue from a situation where prior to his intervention, there is no truth regime, right? There's sophists, there are all these competing peoples, and even as we tell the normal history of philosophy, right, we have, what happens before Plato, right? Again, for those of you who are, think about history of Western philosophy, it's the so-called pre-Socratics. And what are they about? Oh, they're just about lots of things, right? Lots of different frames of reference in terms of which one could define reality. But these things are irreconcilable, right? You just sort of pick and choose them. And of course, across the ages, various philosophers and scientists have picked and chosen one or the other, right? But it's with Plato that you actually get a kind of sensibility which says, look, we got to stop the bullshit. We have to actually resolve at the second order level what it is that we should actually be committed to. What should be the rules of the game for everyone involved? And what this marks is the fact that Plato realizes, in a sense, we're always already living in a post-truth condition, and then the issue is going to be, how do you impose a truth regime? So the idea of there being a truth regime is something imposed. It's artificial. It's not natural, right? It's a point at which some kind of decision gets taken to say, look, this is the frame of reference under which we all have to operate, and if you don't operate this way, you're out of the picture. That has to be imposed. Now, the interesting question, I think, from the standpoint of modern people, is how does it get imposed? Right? Because, as I said with Plato, right? Plato's not talking about this heavy, coercive, totalitarian, we're going to run the tanks through your neighborhood kind of bullshit. He's not talking about that, okay? And I would argue as well that in our societies, in our so-called liberal societies, that's not happening either. No tanks are running through anyone, right? But at the same time, and this is what makes the post-truth condition kind of interesting in our own time, you have competing Platos, basically. I mean, I think that's what you know, in terms of what the is, right? So if you look at Bright News and why it has as much significance as CNN or whatever, it's a Plato thing, right? I mean, in other words, what these guys have all realized, and this is where the media plays a very important role in the modern era in terms of Platonizing things, is that it is the media through which we understand the conditions for the possibility under which true and false can be produced. Okay? And what I'm saying here is not original. This is Walter Lippmann. Okay? Walter Lippmann. This is the man, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe you older people have heard of him. I mean, Walter Lippmann, and he was very directly connecting himself to Plato. This guy knew exactly what he was doing, and he's the man, he's the linchpin between Plato and where we are now. And he basically wanted to, in some way, reinvent a kind of Platonic situation in, you know, 20th century America, basically, right? And for those, how many of you have heard of Walter Lippmann? A lot of you have. Good, very good. Okay, mostly older people, but that's good. So Walter Lippmann, right, so he's this, in the early 20th century, he's one of the first generation of Jews, actually, to go to Harvard, and he's, he's student of William James and all these other great philosophers during the golden age of American philosophy at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. In fact, in Britain, which is where I live, the book The Great Society by Graham Wallas, who was a political science professor at the London School of Economics in the early years. The Great Society, as you know, is LBJ's thing, right? Which was very much promoting civil rights and all the other things, and very directly connected to that. That book is actually dedicated to Walter Lippmann, who was a student, and Graham Wallas gave what turned out to be a very important set of lectures at Harvard that were the basis for the Great Society, okay? What was all this about? Well, you know, if you want to be very derogatory about it, it was all about paternalism, about a kind of progressive paternalism, right? And this was the thing, right? And so Walter Lippmann was incredibly concerned about the role of mass media in a context in which the government didn't have it under control. Right, so again, I don't know how much you know this, but if you've ever seen, some of you may have seen the, if you know the British documentary guy, Adam Curtis, have you heard of him? The Century of the Self? If you're not, you should watch this. It's available online. Okay? The Century of the Self. This came out about, what, 10, 15 years ago? I don't know now. It was a BBC documentary. It's the sort of thing that I show to my students, first-year students. You know, for all the things I do, and as Alex said, I've written over 20 books, right? But I do a lot of bread and butter stuff with regard to teaching, and one of them is so-called life of media, and I always show this. And this has to do with the origins of the field of public relations. Okay? Walter Lippmann was very much involved in this. I should say, for those of you, I mean, I know we're in the United States, but again, Walter Lippmann, when I was a kid, right, so 30, 40 years ago, Walter Lippmann was like the grand old man of journalism. Right? Yeah, some of you know this. Right? And he was seen as the sort of father of objective journalism because he was very careful. He was a man who very much stressed that one should be careful about how one should present the news, you know? You know, the kind of New York Times masthead thing, all the news that's fit to print, which is still there. This is very much Walter Lippmann's sort of territory. And when we talk about objective journalism to a larger, and the idea of that there's a profession of journalism that is dedicated to that idea too, okay? Just to give you a sense of who he was and so forth. But the point is that if you go back to the early 20th century, so again, Walter Lippmann's in his 20s, he's part of the campaign to get America into World War I. Okay? Now, the thing about World War I, again, this is worth remembering, is America wasn't attacked in any kind of direct way. And America, up to that point, had not fought any wars not on its soil. Okay? World War I marked a shift. And so the question is going to be, how do you motivate this? Right? So the war's already happening in Europe. It's already happening. No problem. That's happening. Why should the United States get involved? Why shouldn't it just sort of like step back and not do anything, blah, blah, blah? Especially given that the vast majority of Americans, especially over the previous 50 years, came from Europe to escape what was going on in Europe. Yeah, so why do you get America back involved in European affairs? Why? Okay? So, Walter Lippmann is actually part of the public relations campaign to get Americans to volunteer to get involved in World War I. That's how he begins life. And he has another guy involved. Another guy who Woodrow Wilson, I mean, whatever you want to say about this man. Again, when I was a kid, and I still think about Woodrow Wilson as a very positive guy, but I know there's a lot of people who don't like him anymore. But Woodrow Wilson was very much the man who, you know, pushed America into the global stage, put it out there. And this was how he did it, right? Through this public relations campaign, where in some sense America needed to get out there. And so, one of the guys who Lippmann worked with was Edward Bernays, the founder of public relations. Have you heard of him, Edward Bernays? This man is the founder of public relations. I'm being very serious. He wrote a book in 1928 called Propaganda, the crystallization of public opinion a few years earlier. This is the man. If you want to talk about why is public relations, why is advertising, why is marketing, as it were, the biggest component of capitalism in our societies today, it's because of him. And it's because of him because he kind of won an argument, you might say, that arose after the end of World War I. So Bernays and Lippmann are working together to get Americans to fight a war 3,000 miles away. They succeed in doing it, okay? And then the question becomes, okay, now the war's over. What do we make of these skills, as it were, these things that we've, you know, we obviously have mobilized in order to enable this massive effort to take place? What do we do after the fact? Should this remain in the government's control, or should it be open to the market? That's the difference between Lippmann and Bernays. And Lippmann said it should be under government control, and that's why he spent the rest of his life trying to reinvent Plato. Okay? Whereas Bernays said, open it up to the market. These are great skills. You know, if you can sell a war, you can sell anything. And so let's start selling toasters. Let's start selling cars. Let's start selling anything. Okay? Now, what is this dispute about? It's a dispute about the second order level under which people decide what is good or bad, what is true or false, and so forth. Okay? And Lippmann's position was it should be concentrated. It should be in one hand. And so with regard to things like advertising and so forth, so Lippmann, by the way, in case you don't know, is a counselor to presidents up to the time of Nixon. So we're talking about a guy whose influence extends from Wilson to Nixon, which is, you know, and I think it's not unreasonable to think about this guy as like the epitome of the American century, right? Because this is kind of the period where America really looks good, between Wilson and Nixon, I would say, right? Afterwards, it becomes unclear. But he's there the whole time, and he says, look, his view, and his view did not hold, was that advertising should, whereas you should licensing about the kinds of ads that people can give to goods like that, so people aren't being misled. That was his original. Remember, he is saying this after World War I, and it's after World War I that you start to get radio, right? The kind of mass magazines with the pictures, right? A lot of the stuff that we associate with the kind of mass media, which is, again, part of what Lippmann was writing about, right? That very fact led him to think that we actually, given that technology is moving in this direction, that we actually need to have something a bit more Platonic going on, controlling the conditions under which truth and falsehood are being produced. So he said, look, what you got to be paying attention to is modal power. Bernays took the opposite view. Bernays said, look, open it up to the market. Let everyone do it. Corporations, whatever, let them sell anything. Let, you know, the market decide what turns out to be true or false. Now, Bernays, to a large extent, succeeded. Okay, certainly in the United States, right? But in places like Britain, the issue was different. You know, I would just mention this again. I don't know how much you know about Britain, but this kind of issue arose in the country I live in now. I don't know how many of you know about Lord Reith. Reith is the founder of the BBC, right? The BBC. You should check this guy out, John Reith, because he had a very particular kind of view. And it's, you know, when Americans you know, look very favorably upon the BBC, you know, and I don't have no problem. I mean, I've been living in Britain for a quarter of a century, most of my professional career, and I have to say, the BBC is, in fact, much better, to my mind. But there is a kind of ethic there, right? And it's an ethic that until relatively recently has been, you know, governed by a kind of restriction and monopoly. And what Reith himself said, and this is very important, is that the BBC is about educating, informing, and entertaining people. In that order. In that order. Now, toward the end of his life, John Reith, the founder of the BBC, was interviewed by, you can find this on YouTube. I forgot the name of the guy who did it, but he was interviewed about, you know, where he came up with this idea and all the rest of it. But one thing that came across in that interview was the fact that he was very much influenced by the kind of mass media kind of prospects that were being offered by radio and potentially television, because people in a way knew the television technology even before it became mass available. And he was inspired in part by Mussolini. He thought that in a way, if you want to really get a large number of people in democratic society moving in the right direction, that you have to be steering and guiding them and so forth. And that would be the role of the public provider of media. He's very, you know, the end of his life, so it's like 1950s he's saying this, 1950s, okay? And he says it without any kind of regret or whatever. And I do think that in a sense what they're trying to, in a way, reinvent the Platonic vision in these changing media environments, basically, right? And they do so, you know, and what they look like, you know, vary and so forth. But I think the whole idea that there are these kinds of constraints and restrictions come up. And the reason why they come up is because there's a realization, there's a self-consciousness that what you're doing is actually producing the conditions of the possibility for what people will think is true or false. You're taking that very seriously, okay? And you're not just going to leave it open to a marketplace because you think, in a sense, if you leave it open to a marketplace, you're not sure what's going to happen, okay? Now, the post-truth condition, in the way we understand it now, is one where there are a lot more providers of, you know, a lot more producers of conditions under which things might be regarded as true or false. That's the difference in terms of the position we're in now, right? So even if you were to look at American television back when I was a kid, 40 years ago or so, you know, there were 3 major terrestrial channels. Cable was just launching and not necessarily, you know, covering many people. It was still pretty restricted. But now, of course, we live in a world where we have all sorts of channels, right? And in all sorts of media. Forget about television. You got YouTube. You got everything else going on in social media and so forth. That in a sense, everyone becomes a producer of regimes of true and false. Okay? I mean, that's the situation we're in now. And that's the kind of situation that when we talk about post-truth, we need to think about. So in other words, it's not comes out of the blue, okay? Because guys like Bernays have been arguing for this, you know, since the end of World War I. And you might even think that the sophists back in ancient Greece were sort of arguing for this as well, because they were promising to tell you how you could win an argument. You know, if you pay enough money, I can tell you how to win arguments. I can tell you how to get people to believe what's true and false. Okay? So that's been around for a long time. What we have now is kind of the mass production of this, right? So there's a sense in which, with the internet, with the cyber world in which we live, in a sense, the kind of problem that Plato thought he was trying to solve is exacerbated in a major way, right? And you might say that Plato is, you know, so Plato gets credit for being the first one to realize the problem, right? But the way we solve it, if we want to solve it now, is going to be completely different from what he would solve, how he would solve it, because we live in a different media environment from the one in which Plato lived, right? And so looking at guys like Lippmann and Bernays, for example, is very useful, because they, in a sense, are transitional people between the kind of world that Plato would be, you know, exemplifying, and the world that we understand now. And I should just tell you, you know, the reason why I stress this point is that I know certainly in the United States, there's a kind of nostalgia still for guys like John Dewey, you know, these kind of people, who Lippmann actually, you know, was in debate with during the period that we're talking about here in the 1920s. And Dewey's just backward. You know, I mean, he's just backward. He doesn't get it. Right? Dewey's a kind of well-meaning guy who doesn't get it. He doesn't get the way in which the change in the media environment changes how we need to think about what the issue is. And Lippmann got it. Whatever you want to say about Walter Lippmann and whatever political affiliations he had over the years, because they all sort of shifted and so forth, he got it. Walter Lippmann knew what was going on, okay? If you have to talk about one guy who really understood kind of the way the world was going, especially from the American standpoint, he's the man. He's the man you still pay to. John Dewey is, he's, you know, he's kind of like what? He's nostalgic, he's oppositional, you know, but he's not real, okay? And I think from the standpoint of how we need to think about stuff, because look, at the end of the day, the reason why I'm giving you a talk on this, and the reason why I'm writing a book about this, is because the post-truth condition is prevailing, okay? So whether you're nostalgic about John Dewey and blah, 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 it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We're in the age of Trump. I'm someone who voted for Hillary Clinton even back in 2008 against Obama, because she's the most qualified person in the United States. I'm happy to say that. I love the woman. But clearly something's changed in the world where that kind of moniker doesn't matter. Something else has happened. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the difference between what's true and false, how the conditions for, you know, what's appropriate, not appropriate, what's good, what's bad, those things are shifting. And they have a lot to do with the changing media environment. And so when we talk about something like Breitbart News having as much influence as so-called respectable news agencies, right, to such an extent that now when you turn on Fox News or CNN or whatever, right, they're operating in a way that's kind of oppositional to each other. That's pretty amazing. Because when I was a kid, right, the idea was with the three major terrestrial channels, they were each trying to present some kind of Walter Lippmann style objective journalism, right? I mean, for those of you old enough to remember this, right? But now, with regard to Fox News or CNN or Breitbart, whatever we're talking about, they're against each other. Okay, that's very post-truth. That presupposes a kind of awareness, right, that there are alternative ways of framing reality. And therefore, you have to be operating against that at the second order level, even before you get to contesting whether something is true or false. Okay? So this is the point, right? So this is the post-truth condition. Now, what's the punchline? My punchline is, this is what you should expect if we've got democratization. This is democracy, baby. I mean, you know, you may not like it, but this is what democracy looks like, right? Just to remind you, there's democracy, okay? This is democracy. This is what it looks like, right? Once you start having a situation in which, in principle, anyone can take control of the conditions under which everyone believes what is true or false, that's real democracy, right? And then they contend amongst themselves. But the fact that anyone, in principle, could be in control of the, you know, of which truth and false is produced, that's democratic. That really is, right? And so this guy Breitbart is some kind of lunatic, right? You know, who died a few years ago, right? This guy has had an enormous amount of power. That's a testimony to democracy. It's not testimony to how stupid people are, it's how smart they are. Because the intelligence comes at the second order level, right? They figured out how the game works. And they've taken control of the rules of the game. Okay? And they're trying to dictate how everyone else then plays it. That's the post-truth condition. Okay? And we're not going to get away from that. This is just the beginning. Oh, you know, who knows what's going to happen to Trump, right? But the point is that even if he disappears, we're not going to disappear from this kind of world that we entered into. And I would argue to you, and we can have a discussion, that this is, if you believe in democracy, okay, and you believe in democracy in a world in which numbers of people are being educated, and being educated in the media that are available to them, to have some kind of influence, opinion, it's fact exactly what you should expect. So at the level at which scholars are normally engaged with this thing, there really shouldn't be a problem with this. What should be a problem, of course, is that, you know, Donald Trump won rather than someone else won, right? But that's a kind of local disagreement. That's not that's a disagreement, you know, in terms of I wanted my team to win rather than your team to win, but it's not a disagreement about the rules of the game, because now it's a different game. Okay? And so I'll stop here and take some questions. But otherwise, but my general point, this is the point that comes out in the book, is that the post-truth condition, I mean, the only people who should really be against the post-truth condition are anti-democrats. That's my view. Otherwise, everybody else should be able to roll with it. Okay? I'll stop here and take questions. Yes? Do you need a mic? No. Okay.
I went to journalism school in the 80s in Israel, and at that time, newspapers were very much affiliated with political parties or political bents, and it was understood that if you wanted to collect information, you read a morning paper, an afternoon paper, an evening paper, and then you collected some semblance of information, and then you could figure it out according to your own political needs. So how is this condition now different?
It's not different. No, it's not different if that's what people are doing. No. But certainly, I would say that the condition we're in now actually allows this to happen more easily if people are motivated to do so. And so this is why, you know, in terms of the so-called pathologies of our cyber age, you know, the echo chambers, the filter bubbles, things like this, where people aren't actually sampling from the different media environments to get the range of opinion you're talking about. But no, that's not different. That's not different. But in a sense, one of the problems, I think, of the kind of age we live in, and I blame Steve Jobs for this because he's the man who made convenience kind of the end of everything, is that you get reinforced in what you already believe. That's the problem for our age, okay? That's the problem, that people aren't incentivized to actually think differently about their points of view and to think that things could be otherwise. That's, I think, more the problem. But the point is, you're right, yes, the possibilities are available in principle now, yes. There was someone else, I thought. Yes?
Don't you think that the Supreme Court appointment of John Roberts and the Citizens United decision allowed a lot of money to be poured into politics, and it really changed the news? I mean, that was wasn't that the big point that really, when everything changed, was Citizens United decision?
Well, I mean, can you explain this a little bit?
Well, you talk about Breitbart.
Yeah.
And that's financed by certain, what are they, investors, wealthy millionaires.
Yes.
So they're the millionaires want to influence thinking, and actually the DeVos is up in Michigan.
Yeah.
You know, the millionaires, they're using the Citizens United decision to influence thinking. So we elect someone like Donald Trump so they can get a tax cut.
Well, that might be true. Yes, but I mean, but what lesson do you want to draw from that?
Well, I mean, don't you think that there's a lot of people that want to see Citizens United overturned?
Well, maybe.
So that we'll get a little more truth, because what the millionaires are selling is
Okay.
they're selling their story.
Okay, look, I think there's two ways to go on this matter, and this is where it gets kind of interesting from a political standpoint. And my views have changed over time, because you seem to be suggesting that what we should be doing is in some way constraining people's abilities to influence political processes. And the alternative would be actually to make it easier for other people to influence political processes, right? And you know, so in other words, to dilute the impact right, that you're talking about. To dilute. So the question is, how do you dilute the impact of what you're talking about? And there are two ways to go. One is to say we have a more restrictive government that, in a sense, in advance, you know, gets very concerned about what's true and what's false and who's putting too much money in and all the rest of it, versus actually making it easier for other people to influence things in an already existing environment. You see what I'm saying? I mean, there's a difference between going, you can go one way or the other way on this issue in order to address your problem.
Well, the other thing is that they have the money to buy the politicians.
No, I understand that. I understand that. I mean, the question is, what is the solution to that problem? Right? The solution could be stop them from giving so much money, right? Which seems to be what you're suggesting, versus saying we should encourage other people to give just as much money so that alternative politicians can, you know, push ahead of them. And then try to figure out ways that could happen, right? So in other words, you start coming up with more proactive ways of as it were, counteracting their income without stopping them. And you see, it depends what your conception of democracy is here. Yeah?
I'm wondering how well it travels across cultures, democratic cultures. I mean, democracy as an institution, there's a lot of commonality, obviously, across all democratic countries. But in some countries, some democracies, you have very strong anti-intellectual strains at the cultural level. Obviously, in America, we have that. And in other democracies, that may be much less pronounced. And that also could be connected to class. Back to the previous question. So I guess I'm wondering, is this a uniquely American and maybe other anti-intellectually oriented democracies?
No. No, see, I don't see Breitbart as being particularly anti-intellectual. It's just kind of counter-intellectual, right? I mean, if you've ever, I mean, again, I don't know how seriously you people have read the works of Andrew Breitbart, right? I mean, but he's not an idiot, right? I mean, there's a sense in which there is a mentality there, okay? And I think often what we call anti-intellectual is kind of anti-academic left, to be honest, okay? And so, I mean, so I don't think this is an issue about intellectuals, actually, because I think it's an issue about whether one actually understands the means of production under which the conditions for true and falsehood are produced. And I think that even though academics talk a big storm about Foucault and all these other guys who talk about the conditions of the possibility, blah, 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 you know, all these kind of post-Kantian, pseudo-Kantian kind of guys, right? They don't know the clue about how to actually launch alternative conditions for the possibility of what people think are true or false, right? And they don't understand the media. And I think, I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, what is a hidden premise in what I'm talking about here is the idea that we're talking about mass democracy, and how exactly do you engage a mass democracy, right? Because with a lot of the guys like Rousseau and a lot of the earlier guys, right, they thought that you really couldn't have a democracy unless you had a relatively small society, right, where you would never get into these kinds of issues in a way. But I think when we start talking about mass democracy, then it's a different story, and it's going to be about ability to control the media. And I think if you're going to be democratic in a mass society, then what you want is multiple media outlets. And the problem that we have now in the U.S., you know, or you know, more in the U.S. than other parts of the world, but I'm sure it's going to spread as other U.S. things do, is that in a sense the right wing, politically speaking, have figured this out first. I mean, I think the left wing are clueless, frankly. I mean, they're certainly clueless in Britain. I mean, you know, so the thing is that you know, you've got this, and one of the ways you can see that the right wing are controlling everything from media standpoint is the fact that everybody's just spending their time focused on Trump. I mean, as someone who comes to the United States a lot, but lives in Britain, whenever I come to this country, you know, I got to say, lay off on, you know, let Trump, as it were, self-destruct if he's going to just, you know, rather than just keep on dumping on him, because that just plays to the kind of right-wing vision of Trump as a guy who's trying to do a lot of stuff, but he's being prevented from doing it. So in a sense, you know, the Breitbart guys have won that argument already. That's why it was convenient to get rid of Steve Bannon, because they've already kind of got that part of the story already solidified. Because you just need to turn on CNN or, you know, MSNBC or any of these things in this country, and you just see people dumping on Trump for whatever reason. Whatever else is happening in the world. Right? And that plays to his narrative, which is exactly what those guys want. So they're controlling the rules of the game, even though they may not have the largest market share or anything like that, right, from a strictly, you know, quantitative standpoint, but they've skewed everybody else. Yes?
So I take your point about how if we're going to be okay with democracy, we need to be okay with multiple people having sort of the opportunity to put forward their kind of truth value, and that makes sense to me. But the fact that everybody has that opportunity doesn't mean that there can't be some sort of consensus on this second level that you're talking about, which would allow us to conduct politics. So it seems to me that from about the 1930s to the mid-1990s, we had something like that consensus. It was sort of elite negotiated in the United States based on...
Yeah, that's Walter Lippmann's time. Walter Lippmann.
Right,
That's what you're talking about.
You're using the public airwaves, and so then politicians take that opportunity to use the public airwaves to say, we're going to negotiate a standard of the public interest for the use of this space.
Yes.
And that means that basically the political parties agreed that, all right, this is going to be our second regime. And what happens in the mid-1990s is the Republican Party basically decides we opt out of this deal. And so they found, you know, Fox News takes off and they go from there. But it seems to me like you could have a democracy where there is this...
Yes.
Where there is this second level agreement, as long as sort of the major societal groups can kind of negotiate a consensus about these are going to be our standards for truth. And what's happened to us in the last, say, 20 years is one of our political parties opted out of that consensus deal.
Well, that's nice. I mean, if I were Walter Lippmann, addressing your point, because your point is very well taken, Walter Lippmann was saying, well, look, we're really, at the end of the day, not talking about social groups. We're talking about elites, you know, basically agreeing amongst themselves. And this is the Hillary Clinton thing, right? So Hillary Clinton is a Lippmann person, I would say, right? Someone, you know, and this is why when she was the presidential candidate, right, all of the respectable Republicans went to her, right? Remember that? People don't remember that, right? But the point is, so this is Lippmann country, right? Lippmann country would be to go to with Hillary Clinton, and then we could sort of sail across and all the rest of it, and it was great. We got, you know, Sanders was sort of put on the mainstream, sidelined, and so was Trump. That's the Lippmann story that would happen. What I think the Lippmann people don't recognize is the idea that there are different groups, you know, at the level you're, you know, below that. They don't recognize that, right? They basically have, you know, this is where the interesting thing comes about in the 1920s, where you get this idea of mass democracy, right? Where people are floating. Voters are by definition floating, and this is why public opinion and survey research and all this stuff becomes very powerful as a way of capturing it, right? Because everything's and you were making this point yesterday actually about public opinion research, as I recall. It was a very good point actually. And this is kind of the world that Walter Lippmann sees, right? Where the mass people aren't really affiliated to particular groups, but they're just amorphous and biddable. Right? They're biddable. And the question is, you want to kind of restrain how biddable they are. Right? And this is why if you have, at the elite level of government, even though we have nominally different parties, whichever one gets into power doesn't really matter so much. Right? This is Walter Lippmann, right? Plebiscitarian democracy, as it was called back in the early 20th century. Right? And he thought this was the safest form of democracy. So the idea is you don't get to the point where where groups in society actually self-identify in some kind of solidified way. You keep them mobile, right? That is, I think, the image. I mean, the problem was it didn't, you know, obviously didn't work in the last election, right? But one of the things that Trump did, of course, was he started making very specific addresses, not to the American people, but you people who lost your jobs because of this, blah, 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 because of this and that. And he then created a kind of collective identity. You see, that's the thing that you know, that the Walter Lippmann was very much against. He was against this idea that politicians would have that kind of power, where they could actually, as it were, almost construct groups for purposes of winning elections. Yeah, popular. Well, yes. Yeah, sorry, I didn't, yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry, a very long-winded way of saying populism. You're actually right. You're absolutely right. Right, that in a sense, in a democratic society, the thing you want to avoid is populism. Yes. And that's what makes it kind of interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
This may be not directly related to what you're talking about, but the Washington Post did an article on the books that Steve Bannon read.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Some of them were classics, some of them were not very good. But a very curious one is called The Fourth Turning.
Oh, yeah.
20 years ago by a couple sociologists.
Yes, yes.
That projected a 80 to 100 year cycle on American and British history, and said these were broken up into 20-year, 25-year periods based on the kind of child rearing that was going on. If you believe that kind of a thing, we're facing a crisis sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. Does that seem plausible to you?
No, but it did come up at dinner last night, I have to say, Alex. No, but it seems to me that this kind of view does reflect a lot of the thing. I mean, the person who, you know, in terms of Steve Bannon, the person I've looked at in some detail, I don't know, Julius Evola. Have you heard of this guy? I've just put the name up there. No, but I don't actually believe that part of the story. But Steve Bannon is actually kind of a complicated guy. So this guy, Julius Evola, who is a kind of interwar European social theory, Italian, who's a kind of fascist existentialist kind of person. Well, how to put it, and I think this is kind of what Steve Bannon is trying to push on Trump, is the idea that the way that in a sense we've sort of sleepwalked into a kind of modernity that needs to be broken radically to get back to what really matters, right? This kind of narrative. And so he wrote this book called Ride the Tiger, which was published after World War II. I recommend actually you know, if you want to understand where all this stuff's coming from. So it's a kind of way of thinking about yourself as being radical, but what in fact you're doing is going back to fundamentals. Okay, that's this. I see, you know. So Steve Bannon, I sort of see him in that regard. But this particular point that you're raising about the fourth turning came up at dinner last night. I don't believe it, but it is very much in the mold of these people who, and I didn't really talk much about this, but if you have a kind of cyclical view of history, right, that this kind of view makes sense. You have to start off with a kind of cyclical view of your history, where at some point you figure, you know, everything's going to naturally redeem itself, and you know, this is just a period of captivity or whatever, and then we're going to overturn it. Yeah, I mean, but I don't buy it. I don't buy the details. Let's put it that way. Yes, sir.
I'm not asking this to contest anything you said,
Oh, go right ahead, though. You go right ahead.
But it's better to understand and clarify. It doesn't sound like you're promoting this view you've been talking about, but you're more or less saying this is the reality. Like it or not, this is the way things are, this post-truth regime that we're in. And so you might say like water. Walter Lippmann and John Reef are dead. Long live Edward Bernays.
Well,
Is that sort of
well, look, I mean, well, you're right. I mean, you're right at you're right at the level at which you might say officially I write my book, in the sense that my primary purpose is to actually alert people that this is like the real deal. This is exactly how the world works. It's not an aberration. I mean, I think there are a lot of people still out there who somehow think that, oh, if we impeach Donald Trump, the world will come back to normal, right? I mean, there are some people out there who think that, right? And I think that's why everybody's so keen on getting rid of Donald Trump, in part, is that. Namely, that if you get rid of him, then you get rid of the problem, we go back to normal. I'm saying there's no normal here to go back to. Right? So it says the post-truth condition is here. Right? So my view is if you're going to be against Donald Trump, just be against him in the same way as you've been against any other politician in the past, but don't somehow think this guy is just some kind of weird aberration. Because we're, in fact, going through a transition. Okay? Now, whether I like it or not, I have to say I'm a Democrat. Okay? And even though I voted for Hillary Clinton not only in the last election, but also in 2008 when she was running against Obama, you know, registered in New York State. The fact of the matter is the world's changing. And what we need to do is we need to rethink what our norms, especially if we think of ourselves as progressive people, which is how I think of myself, right? A very progressive person. But at the same time, you have to say, okay, what's progressive in this context? Right? Because if you've got a notion of progressivism that basically alienates a lot of the people you're trying to bring along, that's a problem. And I think Trump picked that up. Right? And this is what Hillary didn't pick up. Because when Hillary made that statement, and my book begins with this, you know, the basket of deplorables. Remember that one? The basket of deplorables. Oh, my God. What a nightmare. When she started, you know, talking about Trump supporters as a basket of deplorables, that was, oh. But of course, everybody kind of, you know, those who were already sympathetic to her sort of say, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. But that's not the sort of thing you say. And Trump just jumped on it. And you know, and in a sense that was kind of, in a way, that's kind of a signature line from the campaign, I would say, in 2016. Right.
Would you comment then on Putin's influence on democracy?
Well, I don't know what Putin's up to be perfectly honest. But I'm thinking, you know, my guess is he's a little, he understands this. That's all I would say. That's all I would say. I don't know. I mean, I don't know in any special way what he's done. But I think he understands this. And I think he understands, in particular, the kind of issue that I've been raising, namely, that there is, you might say there's almost a kind of false consciousness with regard to ourselves in terms of what we think democracy is. Right? We have a kind of, you know, so the fact that we so violently revolt against Trump's win, I think Putin immediately sees this as a weak point, that we don't quite know what we're talking about when we're talking about democracy. That would be my initial, but I have no inside knowledge about how Putin operates otherwise. Yeah?
Does that go back to what you were saying right at first, like what you were referring to
Second order?
Second order stuff. Can I infer from that that there's like the first order is of truth is like there's some
There's a regime there.
objective,
Yeah.
but that's all fallen away.
It's not falling away. It's the, look, the conditions, look, here's how to think about it. I think the easiest way to think about it is to think about the fact that the way we can draw distinctions between true and false is in terms of a language, right? So you can say X is true or X is not true, right? And that's going to be relative to the language you're actually operating under, right? I mean, and so it depends how you actually state the claim. So you can say it is raining, it is not raining. And, you know, if you've got a language you can make that distinction, then you can say whether it's true or false. So that's what a truth regime is. A truth regime is one where you've got a language where you can kind of make the difference between whether something is the case or not the case. And the question is, you know, with different languages, as you know, right, the world's carved up in different ways, right? And so if you've got a different language operating, right, in a way, the same phenomena might actually look different because it's being carved up in terms of different basic categories in terms of how you say the world is. You see? So it's that kind of thing. Yeah?
I'm wondering about, if I think about my students.
Yeah, and I think about my students too.
And they strike me as optimistic and changing the world and
So why should they be pessimistic?
well, I don't know. I guess the point is that generational change is happening also along
Yes.
with this. And the young are getting more educated, and the more I would guess that education correlates with more education is probably, or less education probably correlates with more populism and that kind of thing. And I guess I'm just, I mean, I think the young people see how dysfunctional the system is, more perhaps than before in our generation, and are maybe more willing to do something about it.
No, I agree. And I think
Your narrative is kind of static, and I guess I'm wondering whether there's any dynamic dimension
No,
because of generational change and learning across the generations.
Of course there is. Look, I'm telling you, look, the reason why I'm telling you this story is because you should appropriate it. Right? In a way, I'm on Bernays' side of this issue. There's a sense in which you should appropriate this. You know how this is happening. It's not mysterious. Right? There's a sense in which it's a product of free market capitalism in a way. And the only question for young people, it would seem to me, is whether you want to stop it from proliferating, which would be very difficult to do, I think, or whether you want to get involved and actually come up with your own, you know, alternative Breitbarts, basically. That's kind of what I'm suggesting, I would say. Okay? I mean, unless you want to talk about imposing Plato-style censorship, which would just sort of stop the nonsense. But I think that's really hard to do, frankly. And look, even somebody like Putin, you know, you were mentioning Putin earlier. My personal view about Putin's effects on the American elections or Britain or whatever is kind of, he allows stuff to happen. He allows stuff to happen. He doesn't dictate stuff to happen. He allows stuff to happen. And that's enough for things to happen. Okay? So in other words, you know, you don't need to engage in explicit propaganda campaigns. You don't have to engage in censorship explicitly. There's a sense in which you can take advantage of the freedom that's available in cyberspace to enable people to do stuff that they're already predisposed to do. I think that's the bottom line with regard to what Putin has done in the United States and maybe Britain and other countries, is that. I think it's going to be very hard to find some kind of smoking gun or anything like that. But that's because he understands how this media works. And you don't always have to dictate stuff. Right? You just have to have a general climate of opinion and so forth and let people operate. And what? I'm not going to stop that. I just think you got to wise up to it. And you got to be able to use it to your own advantage. That's all I'm saying. Use it to your advantage. He has. Why can't you? Rather than trying to shut it down.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Well, that's the idea, isn't it?
Okay, so that's the way democracy operates now, and it's pretty much accepted that democracy is the best, probably the best system.
I think so. Yeah. What are you going to go back to?
I don't know. I find it very troubling. Again, I'm not contesting what he's saying. I'm just saying, like, this is the way it is. It's like, how can this come to any good?
We just don't win all the time. This is the point. I think there's a problem here where us academics, such very intellectual, knowledgeable, blah, blah, blah people, think we always, have to be winning. We lose a few. That's the price of democracy. And maybe we learned something from it. Yes?
Well, I think it's all about, presuming that the election was a democratic election. There's lots of evidence that it was not, in fact, democratic, in the sense that there's been gerrymandering, there's been construction of a situation in which, certain candidates win even though they don't have popular base. So, to add that into the conversation, so it's not so much about people convincing other people of different realities, but of creating a structure that is unequally favoring some candidates over others.
So you're trying, look, I'm sympathetic to what you're saying because, again, as I said, I voted for Hillary, but the United States has an electoral college which decides on who the president is, and it's pretty clear that the Trump people kind of gamed this better, right? Because what matters is who wins the particular states, and it's a winner-take-all thing, right? So even though Hillary, got 3 million more votes or something than Trump did, doesn't matter. And that's not, has nothing to do with Russia, I think. I think that has to do with just the rules of the game. Now, you might want to make a meta-argument that we shouldn't actually have an electoral college or it should be done differently or whatever. That's fine, okay? But again, if we're talking about what we've got here, until I'm shown otherwise, this seems to me to have played by the rules of the game. That's at least what it seems to me, unfortunately. But that's what, you see, that's more of a reason why I would say that you should give Trump free rein to do what he wants so he can screw up on his own terms. The problem is if everybody's obstructing him, then when it comes around to 2020, he's going to say, hey, I tried to do X, Y, and Z, but what happened was Congress got in the way, blah, blah, blah got in the way, right? And his base will believe that, right? So the point is, okay, this guy's in office. That's granted. Let him get on with the job and see what kind of job he does. Because that would be the best way to get rid of him, I think, in the current circumstances. That's my view. Play by the rules. Sure. Yeah, well, no, I'm just wondering once you get over the fact that Trump won and nobody expected it, what is it exactly that you're upset about?
I'm upset about that. I'm upset about the people who are upset at the fact that our system is unfair. Because our system has never been fair. Our system is consistently disadvantaged.
Well, okay.
I know. We're opening up a whole
Yeah, look, you might as well then just junk the Constitution. Look, there's a sense in which I realize I'm in an academic company here and people will criticize things at multiple levels. But, at a certain point, What are you talking about? I mean, are you talking about junking the Constitution, because this was the point I was raising with her, namely that if you have a problem with the Electoral College, well, exactly, that's an issue, right? But that's an issue that you can raise independently of this particular election, and so those two things are kind of separate. Now, you might think as a result, right, that you might want to do it, and I may have some sympathy with this. I mean, depends what your proposal is. But the point is, these are separate matters, and what I don't want to do is for people to sort of just jump to a kind of blanket skepticism about the possibility of politics and democracy, blah, blah, blah. I know, you start getting metaphysical and all the rest of it. That's rubbish, okay? I'm sorry. I actually believe politics works, okay? And this is how it's working now. And again, what I would say is that those of us, we have to learn to accept defeat and learn from it and do better. That would be my kind of major lesson as far as, and the post-truth condition is not going to go away. Because the only way we're going to get back to a kind of position that you seem to be harking back to is one where relatively few people, perhaps elites, actually do control the rules of the game. It seems to me that's what you really want. You want some Lippmann-like state. Maybe a Lippmann-like state, that is run by academics and whatever, right? But you want something kind of like that, which is in some kind of harmony with it, right? And my view is that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And that's not really what the trajectory of democracy is about anyway. Okay, so this is where I stand on this. So we got to get used to this and learn from it and do better, right? We can do much better than Trump. I have no doubt about it. But the point is, we've got to learn from it and move from there. But the whole idea of trying to deny it or say that, we have to reinvent American democracy from scratch, that's bullshit. I really think so. This is just an academic fantasy. Sorry. Sure, no problem. Well, thank you very much, everybody.